Like, wait a second, is that happening? Okay,
Hi,
great.
all. Just very briefly, we've just begun recording about 10 minutes into our third meeting of the Future of Severance Tax and Water Funding Task Force. Apologies for forgetting to record at the beginning here. We've just done a brief overview of the previous meetings, and Karen from the Colorado Water Center at CSU has just begun walking through our draft report outline and associated feedback from the task force so far. With that, I'll turn it back to Karen.
Thanks, Nate. Okay, so continuing on here, including comparison of other states, including the use of revenue from severance, how that severance tax is being used. That's a good addition. And then really taking a look at water projects. And we had a comment to clearly define what we're talking about with relation to water projects, what exactly that means. Is this just with reference to large infrastructure projects like dams? No, it's with respect to a very large scope of work that includes all of these different things. So making sure we're defining that. And then there was a comment also, do we need to have, since severance taxes also fund to local government, do we need to have kind of a C that talks about local government funding and the use of severance taxes for local government funding? Um, and I would kind of like to open that up actually to this group and have a little discussion. Do we need to spend some time on that?
I think that's a great point, Karen. And yeah, I would love to hear from everybody, but especially Eric and Elise and Jim as our sort of local government reps. And I see Elise has her hand raised, but I think a separate section for local government does make sense.
I agree.
Steve,
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, even if it's not part of the legislation specifically, I know a lot of local government funding is used as match to other state water grant or water plan funding. So I think it's a good just to recognize that it's in some format.
And I'll add to that just to ensure that we're not inadvertently jeopardizing any existing funding that heads to local government.
Okay, great.
while while we're on the topic of sort of the um, different sort of funding sectors we're talking about, I did want to point out, um, there's this local government section. I also think it's important to cover the different categories of water funding. And I would love to hear from our, more local government oriented folks about potential different categories in local government funding. But as I see, the broad scope of water funding in Colorado, there's severance tax funded water projects. There's non-severance tax funded water projects like the Water Plan Grant Program coming from sports gambling, the Division of Water Resources, which is primarily general funded, um, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Program, which is partially funded um, by registration of watercraft in the state. And so I want to be sure we are capturing both the scope of current funding for those sort of non-severance tax water categories and needs assessment for those other categories. And again, would defer to folks with a little more expertise on the local government side as to whether that distinction or those sort of different categories are necessary to make sure we're outlining for local government. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, so I guess the comment I'd made earlier was kind of referring to some of the water conservation districts. The River District has a large grant program that really is tailored for water programs. Here in Southwestern, we have a small program, but it's used quite a bit with WSFR match funding grants. So that kind of local government is where I was thinking within the water space.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. Capturing both, not just state funding, but what local funding sources are maybe necessary to capture as well.
Yep.
Federal certainly as well. Eric, go ahead.
Thanks, Nate. And maybe I'll get snapped back by Steve and or Elise. Do we want to kind of maybe do the same thing for the local government piece? I consider the energy impact program to be the infrastructure funding program for local governments. We have a couple other pots of money out there, as a community development block grant, public facilities dollars. I think we have the loan program, the state revolving loan fund or loan program. Out of the Water and Power Authority. But it might be useful since we're talking kind of globally, and I'd like to maybe hear what Steve and Elise think about that. Maybe also alongside talking about the severance tax, the program and the use of infrastructure at the local government level, but also what other things are out there. I'm not sure that fits or not. I'm interested in hearing some feedback.
I certainly think that fits just as well. I mean, all these programs are used for specific types of projects, for match monies, cobbling things together all the time. So I think it's important.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So we have, just kind of summarizing, I added in a note for the local government funding section to include kind of a similar overview of different types of projects, organizations, how local government is funded, including non-severance tax funding. Is that correct? Yes, okay. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, current mechanisms used to fund local government, with a similar range of topics. Nate?
Yeah, just before we move on from this section, I don't know, I don't think we need to add anything necessarily, but I wanted to just note for folks and for you, Karen, and folks listening in that I think the future funding projections from existing sources, I just want to note that I think the ease and availability of such forecasting differs on a short-term and long-term basis. So I think short-term forecasts for all of these sources are very readily available and produced by multiple sources in the state. OSPB and Legislative Council staff both forecast all of these revenue sources quarterly. I think the longer-term forecasts are a much more difficult proposition. And so I think it'll be important, I think, to reflect both to some degree, but I just wanted to note the contrasting difficulty between short and long-term forecasting. But I view the charge of this task force as addressing, the long-term viability, and so I do think we will need to drill into some way to address that longer-term question, at least to some degree. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm thinking about resources that have been shared both during task force meetings and during some of our interviews. And I would say, as we continue to develop this report, what I envision is, we have this heading of future funding projections from existing sources, and then we have a list of our resources underneath there that show just some of the information we've compiled for that. And if there are others that we are missing, getting your feedback and making sure we have those sources would be really helpful. Brian?
I'm sure that you all are thinking about this. I guess I'm curious about your reaction to it, but the interplay of these existing funds that are the non-severance tax funds and the severance tax funds, and how those interact, and how we foresee them interacting over the future. I think that's why we're all here. but being explicit in this report of saying you know, as we see downward pressure and sweeps on severance tax, that impacts the ability of these other funds to do what they were intended to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've heard similar statements made during some of our interviews that we've been doing is the recognition that, these are not kind of distinct things. When one thing is affected, it affects the ability to fund other types of projects. I know something that was mentioned in our last interview that we had was the ability, some of the ability to fund particularly environmental water related projects kind of that gets the lowest priority at sometimes if there's not enough funding to go around. And so having an idea of interacting, yeah, when one funding source dries up, how does that affect funding for other types of projects? I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I would say as we're continuing to draft this report, I would encourage task force members to think of examples where, you know, a reduction in severance tax revenue or another one of these impacted the ability of a community or a program to match with other dollars and ways that we could demonstrate that interconnectedness in a really tangible way for, the General Assembly ultimately absorbing this report, I think would be really helpful because I think it is such an interconnected ecosystem, but the as specific as we can be about that, I think the better. Jim.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. So I was just thinking when I think of funding water projects, predominantly it's funded by the taxpayer of the local entity that needs the water project. So whether it's a water district or in our area, a ditch company, they're funding a lot of it themselves. And and with the help of some matching funds, some of which come from federal partners. So we use those a lot, especially, I can just think of a project that was done on my ranch with Ducks Unlimited and NACA funds and things like that. But it was coupled with some local or some state funds from Severance Tech. So all of those are are used together. And so the loss of some of these could impact the kind of matching dollars that we're able to get, I guess. So I'll try to think of more of those specific examples that I can give to you. But in the end, we pay a lot just from the local residents or farmers that need the water project themselves.
It's a
Great.
good point.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jim. Sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Well, I was wondering if there's data on, CWCB funded water projects that includes, I'm looking at like a bar graph and it shows the amount of match that's coming from kind of local entities, federal entities, and then the portion provided by CWCB, and the different pots of funding that CWCB has, and what is covered by
Right.
sales tax.
Because it could be the loan. One could be the loan and some can be the grant, but all through CWCB. And I know, being on the board, you looked for those matching funds to come in from other areas to help solidify the funding. But Anna's coming up.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the way that we collect our data through our portal, we can identify the overall match, but we don't have the ability to easily distill that down into different types and sources. So, well, I think it'd be great to know that. It would be kind of a manual lift to go through the history of our programs.
Okay,
I,
that's good to know.
I wonder if it would be possible, as you've expressed, Anna, you know, reflecting the total match dollars being leveraged by a CWCB grant, I think is relatively easy. I wonder if it would be possible to, you know, in a few maybe representative example cases, drill in on and we could probably work with task force members who have represented organizations with CWCB grants and just try to maybe a couple case studies that show how an individual community or district has matched all of, for one project as maybe a representative example, but just one thought.
That's a good idea. And I see Eric commented in the chat, USDA rural development is another key source of local government infrastructure funding to note. Anna, did that sound like a feasible option for you all? Not as much of a big lift?
Yeah, just to look for a few case studies, certainly. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And I would also put that call out to, either task force members who can think of a good example or about a highly leveraged project with a lot of match, or folks listening in online, if you have examples you'd like to highlight, please. We've got an online portal to submit comments, and yeah, would love to hear from folks on examples on that front.
Great. Okay, good discussion. We'll keep going. And I will say, we're going to start really drilling down on the lit review, like I said, over the next month and get that fleshed out. We continue to welcome feedback on any of these areas as we develop this. So if, something comes up after this call and you have an aha moment and you want to send us an email, we're always very much open to continuing to get feedback. So this is not your only chance. It's just a good chance.
Along those lines, Karen, I
Yeah.
would maybe say too, for those listening from the public, once CSU provides this report to the task force in January, that product will be available on our website, and we'll welcome public comment too about what should we provide more detail on, or perspectives on what's already in there, ideas for what's missing. So definitely this is, the task force talking through this now, but we are very open to public comment as well on the structure and content of this report as well. So thanks.
Okay, we will keep moving on. So moving on to, I guess, the results portion now. So this is where we'll provide a summary of meeting interviews that we've had with task force members, the meetings that we've had, and the feedback that we've received during these meetings, interviews with community members, folks that are from various agencies and communities that are impacted or use severance tax funding, and present discussion of those results. We did have a comment. Are we planning to provide other avenues for input rather than just interviews, and a web portal for suggestions, which I believe we have, right, Nate? And they can, task force members can go onto there and provide feedback at any point.
That's correct. As can members of the public.
As can members of the public.
And I see sponsors of the legislation commented, as can sponsors of the legislation.
Yeah, I'm wondering if some specific follow-up with sponsors of the legislation would be useful or necessary, but I can follow up on that idea maybe with Nate at a different time.
I think so, Karen. I think with the initial draft, I think having visibility for the legislative sponsors will be a good step for us to take. So
yeah. Okay. And then included in kind of the recommendations. So the way we envision this is, as we've discussed on these calls, is really kind of a menu of options that we put in some sort of framework as being, feasible to less feasible, perhaps. And in having a discussion that includes a consideration of barriers. And I think, we're continuing to gather feedback on just a broad list, like brainstorming options, which is what we're going to move on to in just a second here. But then considering the barriers that go along with those, and those can be, social, political barriers. They can be tech, uncertainty barriers. They can be related to a timeline. It would just take too long to actually implement. So considering that when we make those recommendations, and next steps, additional considerations. That is the draft outline. And I would open it up. Is there anything else that we need to be considering here that has not been brought up or is not currently in the outline? And again, this is not like forever hold your peace. This is a good opportunity to provide feedback that can help us in our next phase of report development. Steve.
I guess the only thing I would add, and I think you said this when you were talking, and I'm referring to needs assessment. Obviously, outside just literature, there's probably lots of local sort of known needs, feasibility studies, things like that. So I think you mentioned the BIPs. I think that's a great place to go because that's sort of a broad regional. But even like Jim was talking about, some of the local entities really understand their needs and feasibility there. So just brought it beyond just literature.
What do you have in mind for that understanding local needs beyond a literature review of available data?
As best as you can, trying to reach out to some of the local districts and probably folks at CWCB that deal with them on a regular basis may have a better understanding. I just think there are probably identified needs that aren't sort of documented in the literature specifically. And provide good examples of how large those needs and what those needs look like. So it may not be very easy to get hold of, but I think it's out there.
Okay, and you don't, that those needs are currently not in the BIPs, the Basin Implementation Plan, you think?
I think some of them are certainly, but probably not all of them.
Okay.
So I think that's a great suggestion, Steve, and I would just encourage Karen, if this isn't something you've discussed with the CWCB team yet, that CWCB has conducted needs assessments like this for the iterations of the water plan. And so I think understanding that methodology and either building on it or using it as it exists, I think would be helpful because I'm sure that they've thoughtfully turned over all those rocks in previous iterations. So
Yeah, I guess I would just add sort of one example. Needs us or the BIPs are done what every 5 years, Anna, give or take. So in Southwestern, we take the latest needs assessment and we sort of keep updating it ourselves, adding projects to it, updating projects, status of projects, just so we, as best we can, have sort of a real-time list. Probably some other districts and basins do that as well. So, and then when we redo the needs assessment, we're kind of ready to submit that.
So it sounds like an outreach to the perhaps both the water conservancy districts, but also the basin roundtables might be a good holder of information.
Maybe a discussion at a C9 summit when you have all the roundtables together, something like that might be appropriate.
Anna?
I would just add, Karen, if it's helpful, we could coordinate a conversation with our water supply planning team that does try to keep the project's database updated on an annual basis. And given the timing of this report and when you have to have it delivered, there's just some consideration there. And so I think we could maybe use that we have right now as sort of good, useful information that's readily available. So I'm happy to help set up that meeting if you'd like.
That would be great. Thanks, Anna. I agree. Yeah, we are constrained by time. So any existing information would be very helpful. Eric?
Yeah, thanks. Just so I know we have a very short time frame to get this done, and I just want to make sure I was very clear. When I was talking about other sources, I think it got put under the water projects. I meant under local government funding, under C. That's what I'm saying let's do it for both. I think it's good to do it for water projects, but the same thing for local government funding, infrastructure funding. Does that make sense? The same thing about other. That's where I was going before when I said other sources. Um, I didn't know if it wasn't captured there, and maybe you were thinking it, but since we're very, this is like a month and a half out. You're gonna have very short time, so just want to make sure I was clear in the ask.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I was sort of envisioning it, whereas there's only a single line there now, that the local government section would take ultimately a pretty similar structure as this more
Exactly.
built out.
I think it was implied, but I just, like I said, since we're not going to see each other again until after the holidays, and by then we're already kind of, up against the deadline for kind of an outline and all that. I just want to make sure I wasn't, waiting a month and then going, oh no, that's not what I meant. So
I
thank you
appreciate
for
that.
that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, encourage any additional comments for clarity, making sure we have captured what you all are intending with our brief notes here. Any other feedback at this point on the report outline? Robert?
Thanks. When I look at the legislation, there's the part that says there's a need to study how the state, and the two items that I'm wondering how you're going to incorporate it in are avoid using severance tax to backfill our state budget and begin to pay back the severance tax. Are you going to address some history of that in the report, and how are we going to move forward trying to address those two questions?
It's a great question, Robert. I think they're both important questions. I think a lot of the background section will cover previous iterations where the General Assembly has tapped severance tax. And so I think we'll really work to define the scope of sweeps over the years, any efforts to repay severance tax over those years as well. I think the mechanisms, I guess, as we think of the future work of this task force, I think the mechanisms by which the state would repay severance tax from the general fund are simple, technically, very challenging politically. There's really only one way to do it, which is transferring general fund back into the severance tax. So I have suggested, and I think the task force has agreed in previous calls, that we not spend a lot of time brainstorming about how that particular question might be answered. But I think there will be discussion of it in the background and probably the recommendation section as I'm seeing things. I think how the sort of the interplay between, or the avoidance of sweeping severance tax support the general fund in the future, I think there's more avenues that might be possible there. And so I think I think each of them will be their own sections in the recommendation section of the report. And I think there will just be varying degrees of analysis and concepts. I think repaying the severance tax, probably the shortest section, insulating it from the general fund in the future, probably a bit longer. And I think the most open-ended is future sources of revenue to support severance tax. And so I think they'll all be represented in those sections, but I think to varying degrees of analysis and with varying amounts of ideas. Is how I view it. But any other thoughts from the task force on that?
Hey, Nate, this is Sean Bolton.
Yeah, jump in.
Um, One of the things that I would say on that is, so the task force comes up with new recommendations of new revenue sources. Is there any safeguards that can be put in place to make sure the state isn't sweeping that into the general fund?
That is a fantastic question, Sean. And I think there is already in this outline a consideration of barriers. And so I think we should discuss that risk. And then there are mechanisms, whether it be a constitutionally created trust fund that protect funds from sweeps. As we discussed, I think in the last meeting, new fees and enterprises are somewhat insulated, but not entirely. So I do view us as having some significant discussion in our document around those risks and the ways in which they can be addressed. So yes, great point.
Great. All right. I think we will move on then from the report outline. Stop sharing this document and so now we're going to talk about some of the feedback we got from the surveys that we did, and thanks to those who participated in that. So I just want to go over the questions that we asked, and go over some of the responses that we got. So we asked, considering background resources and information that has been presented thus far, are there any areas you still want clarity on or need additional information? We asked, please list alternative funding options or policy concepts that you think should be investigated in greater depth as part of the study. Ideally, list those that show the most potential or should be prioritized for research. Given the options you listed above, what do you see as the greatest barriers or unknowns for each? And is there anything that has been missing so far from our discussions? Any other thoughts you'd like to share with regards to the task force or the focus of the study? So what I want to spend our time on for this call is thinking more about the concepts that we're going to be putting forth and the concepts that will require further investigation. And I didn't have a chance to compile information related to this question from the interviews that we've been conducting so far, but I think a lot of what we've heard is already represented in what I'm going to present here. So I'm going to present what we've gotten so far from the surveys and then some of the discussions we've had on this meeting, but then also open it up. I'm going to be taking notes and just brainstorming options around this topic, because again, this is really where we're going to be spending our time in the next couple months. And so getting input at this point will help us to determine what avenues we want to pursue. So we've talked about a lot of these new fees or taxes for water projects and other severance tax supported programs. There was talk about, one of the research that was done at some point, a promising option was a bottle fee. There's, again, kind of looking at the barriers. We need to understand what new types of taxes or fees are most politically and socially viable, to take that into account. So we're not just going down a path that is really not feasible at all. Consider methods for increasing returns on any remaining severance tax revenue coming to the state. So for example, investing investing the revenue stream so that you're earning higher returns. I think a question is, again, how do you protect that additional revenue from being swept going forward? That's another question. Examine what Tabor exemptions may apply to existing fund sources, the enterprise option, and then thinking about maybe we have all forms of energy production pay fees similar to severance taxes. Maybe we implement fees for water users. So these are kind of in the new fee realm of things, some ideas. So that's what I have so far. I'd like to hear feedback on these current ideas and then other ideas that are not on this list. And I would open it up to our task force members.
So it looks like Steve got his hand up first by a hair. So Steve, you first, then Brian.
Doesn't matter because I really have sort of a question that is kind of hard for me to wrap my head around, but it seems to me for the water plan fund or water funding, we need to have sort of a dollar amount. What are we shooting for on an annual basis? What's needed? What should be? I mean, if a tax or some new revenue stream is $1 million a year versus one that's $50 million a year, we know we're going to put our time. But how do we understand that? I guess that framework. So that's more of a question that I'm not sure what that answer is.
Yeah, it's an important question, Steve, and I think one that, I mean, as we sort of just discussed, I think we need to work collaboratively to try to answer. I think there's a world in which, while we are building out, that more detailed forecast of future need, that we're evaluating a number of different scale or size revenue options sort of concurrently. And, somebody made a comment about not wasting time going down rabbit holes. I absolutely agree, but I could see, a final report saying, here's our best estimate of the need, and here's a range of possible solutions to either meet that entire need, meet a portion of that need. There's a lot that goes into establishing new fees or new revenue sources. It's not always that the need is easily met by one source or another. And so, yeah, there's a lot that goes into that. And so I think, I think you put your finger on probably the trickiest question that this task force will have to grapple with over the next few months. And it's not easy. So, Brian.
Debrucing of existing funds, I think, is an interesting area to explore. Protecting revenue, new revenue, being more creative with different revenue sources. This may be bigger than us, but if there was a list of all the different tax vehicles around the state that remain to be debruced, how much could be at play. I think that could be an interesting line of work because at the top of your list here, Karen, is bottle tax. I was part of that effort, as were I think a number of folks on this call. I think it's listed here as the most promising. Unless you've heard of Coke or Pepsi. And Coke or Pepsi, to Steve's question is, if we're saying, hey, we need $99 million a year, the second you pursue a $99 million a year bottle tax, Coke and Pepsi have 98.9 million reasons to oppose and fight that, on the ballot. So I worry with some of these measures where, the actual viability of doing any of that. we got lucky with sports betting in that, sports betting was wanted to be taxed because they wanted to be legalized. They wanted to come into market. So we joined forces with them to do that. So I think there's a few, remaining sins out there that could continue. I think some of them are real, real dirty. I think, iGaming, for instance, where grandma can play casino games and slot machines from the comfort of her own couch, and lose the entire retirement fund. 7 states have legalized that. I'm sure somebody in Colorado will be discussing it. I'm not sure that that's the pathway for here, but
Thanks, Brian. Just threw a lot out there. So you, in reference to the bottle fee and the report and research that went into that, is that something you either have already or are able to share with the team for evaluation and, putting on the website? Is that something that can be shared?
probably.
Got it.
I think there's, there are sensitivities with all of this, right? This being a very public forum. And so we can definitely look into what we've got and sort of where we've looked.
No,
Absolutely.
I get it. Thank you for looking into that. I'll also just note, Brian did just sort of throw out a bunch of options there. And, I think worth capturing that as we keep going here. And I think ultimately with the political and social flexibility, those are really squishy questions. And I think, we'll just need to look to the judgment of the members of the task force to decide what ideas are really worth devoting time to and what aren't. And there may be an extent to which, a final report says this is an option that could fill this need, but the General Assembly or the voters need to decide whether it's something we want to do. So I think, that question of political viability may be one that this task force cannot necessarily answer. And I don't think that should necessarily prevent the task force from putting that concept on paper in some form or fashion. So.
I also heard mention in this survey that there was a report by the Nature Conservancy at some point on alternative funding sources for water projects. And I can follow up with a person who referenced that, but I didn't know if that was related to what was being discussed. Sounds like no.
Yeah, no, I think that's a similar effort to what we've got.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess understanding the sensitivities of materials created by private organizations, I would just put the general call out to any organization that has done work into this space and is able to share their work and ideas. We would greatly appreciate it.
Okay, what is missing from this list? Brian threw out a lot of great ideas. I captured in some notes and we'll incorporate that into this further investigations document, but other items up for discussion. And I know I think we have a couple more minutes only for this discussion, so we'll have to move quickly.
Karen, I do think you should feel free to go a little past our
Okay.
scheduled time here. I think, next steps we can maybe cut into a little bit.
The only thing that's coming to my mind as we look at these, some could have voter implications and require something beyond just legislation. And I think we need to make sure that we're identifying that very clearly because that pathway forward is certainly more complex.
Thank you. That's a great point that we would want to make sure we're identifying as some additional barriers. Other thoughts?
I would also just note, I know Karen's already said this, but certainly not the last call for ideas here. And maybe a good time to ask a question, Karen, and not to put you on the spot, feel free to answer this at our next meeting, but I think having an understanding of, just how much time it will take us to really, properly vet a given idea, I think would maybe be helpful. At a certain point, we may want to, set a deadline for new ideas such that it can be appropriately analyzed for inclusion in the report. And so something I think not just for you and the team, Karen, to think about, but also task force members, I think and then we can talk about this in next steps, but I think we should think about how we're sort of structuring that work and when might we want to put an end to new ideas and say, we're going to dig into what we've got. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's one that's been on my mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Nate. And I think, even like what we have down right now in this broad kind of list of concepts, we could have 10 different items under the new fees or taxes, and each of those ones would have to be investigated for its, potential for revenue and barriers. And so, I think in order for this to be useful, we do have to be pretty specific, and that requires its own bit of research. So I'm hoping that by the time we flesh out our next the first draft of the report, we'll have a better sense of kind of the range of possibilities that we're looking at, and then the amount of time that we're going to need to look into all of those possibilities. But yeah, I'm envisioning, I haven't talked with the research team about this, but we're going to want to firm up any new ideas at least by February, if not, ideally sooner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful, Karen. Other thoughts from the task force on that sort of timing element? I guess I'm curious how people react to the idea of having, an idea that's currently on this list has deep analysis, and then last day of February, somebody has, or even in March, somebody has the perfect idea, the greatest idea, but there's not really time to analyze it. How do folks feel about having sort of a differing level of analysis for different ideas? There's something to mull on. Carly?
I can just chime in. I mean, I think it might make sense for us as a task force to take a look at an initial list and maybe come up with a prioritization of what we're looking at. And then that way, sort of as time allows at the bottom of the list, but we identify some of the more promising options first for deepest analysis.
Yeah, I would just add, I can't believe that the end of this task force will be the end of this discussion for Colorado. It will be ongoing.
Yeah, and I like the idea of the task force providing some direction based on an initial list of what we think time should be devoted to. So, Elise?
I think along those same lines, in order to be able to prioritize them, I think staff and consultants could very quickly and easily identify those that seem more immediate and more implementable based on those barriers we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Thank you, Elise.
Okay, so it sounds like at our next meeting, we will want to share prior to that meeting whatever we have developed for the report draft. Which, do we have our next meeting scheduled yet, Nate? I don't think so. Okay.
We do not. I wanted to get the opinion of this group. It's been my sense that meeting after the draft report is due, so in the last 2 weeks of January, would make sense so that we can really, talk through it again, similar discussion as this. But I think also easier for scheduling just based on folks' holiday travel plans. So not scheduled, but I've been targeting the last 2 weeks of January and wanted to see what reactions the task force had to that.
Just a reminder that the last week is Water Congress. So
Yes. Which I also had the thought that could present an opportunity for an in-person meeting if many will be in the Denver, metro area for that. But
yep. Good idea.
Okay, so that's if we have it after the draft report is due, then that would be helpful instead of presenting a partially baked draft report. But then also using that meeting to potentially present that initial list and have a discussion on the prioritization, and then have a cutoff, a date in February by which, we're no longer soliciting any new ideas to add to that list. That sounds like a good approach.
I like that approach and hearing no negative reactions from the task force. Seems agreeable. I would also just, for folks from the public listening in and others, I think any ideas that the public wants to submit, I think it'd be ideal to align with that sort of timeline for task force input. So I think we should make sure that folks on our distribution list, not just those listening in January, both have access to that list, have an opportunity to add, their own ideas or input and know about the task force's deadlines. So that's certainly something we can handle as staff, is making sure that the public is aware of sort of that ongoing work plan.
Great. Well, I think we've already talked about some next steps. Do you have other ones, Nate, that you want to bring up?
Yeah, just briefly. So we've talked about scheduling in the second half of January. I will send a poll to the group. Thanks for constantly entertaining polls to schedule these meetings. As I said, I will target dates surrounding the Colorado Water Congress Annual Convention, which is in Aurora at the end of January, and see if it might be possible for us to get together in person. I'll also offer some dates the previous week, and if those are the only ones that work. We'll meet virtually again. I am eager to try to get this group together in person because I think it's really important to all be in the same room to hash some of these tough questions out, but recognize the vast geographic diversity of this group. So it's a tough task to all get together, but we'll do our best. I also just wanted to note on the topic of next steps is just as a general note for everybody is, while the work of this task force goes on, severance tax continues to be collected, programs continue to operate, and the General Assembly, continues to talk about severance tax. And so it is my hope certainly that deference is given to the work of this task force, but we cannot pause severance tax. We cannot pause discussions about severance tax policy. We, as staff, will do our best to keep this group updated on conversations as they're happening. The Joint Budget Committee has begun meeting. There have been severance tax briefings. I don't know that there's any, big plans or, big sweeping initiatives being considered, but there are, questions being asked, and it's possible that ideas and initiatives do come up or come forward this legislative session. So we'll do our best to keep this group updated. But I just wanted to give folks that general note that, we can't pause this while we work as much as we wish we could. So, but we'll do our best to keep folks updated. Any other thoughts or questions? I feel I appreciate folks being willing to engage in the conversation here. I think hopefully a good indication of the work to come. And I think our discussion of options flowed pretty well into our discussion of next steps. So we'll target meeting at the end of January. I then hope we could get into a more regular cadence of, maybe meeting at the end of February, end of March, end of April, try to get those on the calendar further in advance than we have these first few meetings. And so we'll do our best to get all of those scheduled. And any other thoughts on next steps? And then I think we'll open it up to another round of public comment if we have any. Awesome. Well, these meetings provide a great opportunity for input, but if you have great ideas lying in bed at night, we've always got the link on our website where you can jot them down and send them in, and the team will incorporate them. So that goes for everybody, from task force members to the public. And I guess with that, would open it up to public comment. If anybody is on and would like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak. All right, seeing no one as attendees urging us to let them speak, I think we're just about done with our third meeting here. Appreciate everybody. Any task force members have any last comments or things we didn't cover? Great. Well, I remain incredibly excited about this work and appreciate everyone's engagement so far, and a lot more to come. We'll get this meeting posted to the website as soon as possible. And as I mentioned earlier in the call, all the resources we've discussed will be posted on there soon, and we'll send around public notice of that.
Guys, well, have a good holiday, Nate. Thank you for all your work on this.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.